2JZ versus B58 coming right up.
I won't make it easy for you now. You got 2 minutes of my time.
Okay, quick facts on each engine. 2JZ GTE, we're not talking about the GE here, we're talking about the turbo version, is a cast iron block, came out in 1990-91, was put in the Supra in 1993. It is a 3-litre inline 6-cylinder twin turbo engine, and it has 280 horsepower in Japan, 325 horsepower in Europe, and 320 horsepower in North America. The B58 engine was introduced in 2015, comes out in various BMWs. The 2 Series 240i has 335 horsepower and the Z4 has 385 horsepower. It is an aluminium block, aluminium head. It has a single turbo on it, twin scroll turbo. This basically just means that it has 2 inlets going into the exhaust housing of the turbo. It's really nothing that special. It has a closed deck block. Good grief, every engine has a closed deck block. The reason that they keep stating this is because the N54, N55 that was its predecessor had an open block, which means it had water galleries or coolant galleries surrounding the entire piston area. So the head bolts basically weren't attached to any metal that was then connecting the sleeve of the bore or the cylinder. So the pistons could basically wobble and float as the pistons go up and down. The bores would shake and vibrate. Okay, so now that we have the basic stats of each engine out of the way, we're going to compare the engines in 3 different upgrades of power. The first is going to be stock to BPU. Now from stock, the B58 absolutely has it over the 2JZ. The reason being is the torque curb. So there's a series of new technologies to do with variable valve timing and Vanos, etc. that make the B58 have a really low torque curb. 500 Nms of torque as low as 1600 RPM all the way through to 4500 RPM flat torque curb, which is the main benefit for drivability and what everybody's chasing in a daily road car these days, or even a basic track car. That low down torque really counts, and that's where the 2JZ is missing it. So the drivability of a B58 engine these days is definitely much higher than the laggy system that you got on the old 2JZ GTE. Saying that it wasn't that laggy in the 2JZ, you got 440 Newton meters of torque by 4800 RPM. Now BPU power levels, it's a bit of a Supra term. I mean, I'm a Supra guy. BPU stands for Basic Performance Upgrades, and it's basically a way of pumping horsepower out of your engine with very few modifications. So on the Supra with the 2JZ in it, you would basically put a different downpipe from the turbos onto it, and you would put a 2-inch restrictor in there if it was a JDM model imported from Japan. The American little turbos could take a bit more horsepower, so you wouldn't have to put that 2-inch restrictor into the exhaust. But basically you could get easily 450 horsepower on the stock turbos. Now the stock turbos on the 2JZ and the Supra are run in a sequential mode, so all of the spooling goes into one turbo first, and that spools that turbo up relatively fast, and then a valve opens in the exhaust just through a suction system in the sequential unit, and that routes all of the boost then to the second turbo, so you've got exhaust flow going to both turbos then. This does create a slight little hole in between when the first turbo is spooled and then flicking it over to spool up the second turbo. Now with BPU upgrades on the 2JZ, you usually get on about 17 PSI, you will get about 400 horsepower, 405 horsepower. And this can be done for as little as $300 depending on how much you can buy a dump pipe for. Or you can do it in your garage yourself just like I did. You do have to get a boost cut controller though. Basically this is just a little unit that tricks the ECU. It's just 3 wires that you wire into the ECU. You can buy them off many different companies. Turbo Smart do a really good one. I have a Turbo Smart one in my Supra, Now the 2JZ comes running quite rich from the factory, so you've got room to add more boost there without the engine leaning out. 17, 18 PSI is reasonably safe, so you're guaranteed a 400, 405, 410 horsepower just with a very cheap upgrade. The American engines, you can get them to about 450 horsepower. Some people claim 500 horsepower on the stock turbos, as you can run about 20 to 22 PSI boost without those little turbos destroying themselves. Now the American turbos are actually slightly smaller than the JDM turbos, but they're stronger. They've got steel wheels in them, which enables them to be able to handle more boost. Now the basic performance upgrade of the B58 BMW engine, well, it's come a long way in technology wise since the 2JZ. So instead of using a suction system, the B58 has an electronic boost controller. So there's a lot of companies that do this. They simply just provide a little kit that you plug in. You could call it a chip if you like. Race Chip is one that I've seen a few videos on YouTube about. Here's a little link for them up above. And they can get 403 horsepower. I think it looks pretty reliable out of the B58 engine and stock trim. Quite simple to do. I'm not sure of the price on this Race Chip. There's a few other companies that do it as well, but definitely it's a lot easier, and it would plug into the OBD2 port as well. You probably want to put a downpipe on there as well, but it can be done without the downpipe, and you've automatically got 400 horsepower. Now both engines can well and truly take these power levels and laugh at it, absolutely laugh at it. This is nothing. 400, 450 horsepower to both of these engines is a walk in the park. Now, level 2 power upgrades. This is when we are going to upgrade the injectors and put a larger turbo or turbos onto the engine. Definitely a bigger exhaust, and maybe do work on the intake as well. Now on the B58, the whole water to air intercooler system would probably have to be abolished here. You need to rip that off to get flow and put in a front mount intercooler. On the 2JZ GTE, you probably already have long gone with those stupid intercoolers that they put in the Supra and put a big front mount intercooler in there. But we're going to leave the blocks unopened. The standard pistons, rods in there. The B58 and the 2JZ do not have forged pistons. There's a lot of talk that there's forged pistons in here. They don't. The B58 does have forged rods. The 2JZ GTE does have forged rods. Forged pistons mean that they are billet. They are cut out of one piece of solid material, CNC cut. Neither of these engines have forged pistons in them. Now when you get to this level 2 upgrade of power, basically the whole low torque curve that the B58 has as an advantage before is now gone. You've got to scrap that, because as soon as you change the turbo, you're changing the dynamics of the whole engine. So you might as well strip the blocks back to the bare essentials, and then you start throwing on all your own gear. So basically you want to choose a turbo first, and that's going to determine your horsepower, but it's also going to determine how low end you want the torque. So you've got to judge how much lag you want. So the basic turbo that most people with the 2JZ GTE use is something like a GTX Garrett turbo. A GTX 3582R will get you a solid 375 kilowatts. So you're going to be looking at 500 horsepower, pretty easy out of that turbo, pretty capable depending on how much boost you want to run through the engine. You've got to upgrade the injectors. You want to run anywhere from 650cc injectors up to 1000cc injectors. Actually 850s are a pretty good choice because they'll still get a pretty good idle on there. But 500, 550 horsepower, this is where you'll be aiming for this turbo, even up to 650 horsepower with the GTX 3582R. Now you would get pretty much the same power figures with the B58, but you've got to work all of this in with the variable valve timing. Now you've got a major benefit here as well with the B58 engine, is that you can actually tune the ECU. So dyno tuners should be able to bang into the ECU here. With the 2JZ GTE, you're going to have to get an aftermarket ECU. But once you have put this in, there's plug and play ECUs, cost you anything from $1,800 with a link unit. or a Vipec, something like that, all the way up to, go for your life with a Motec up to $5,000. Anything is possible, but you're going to have to dyno tune it to get to this stage, and you've got to be ready to spend $5,000 up to easily $10,000 of modifications to the engine to get somewhere in between 500 up to 700 horsepower. Both of these engines will handle, I would say, 650 to 700 horsepower without changing the pistons at all, or rods. Level 3 power upgrades. Now we're talking some big numbers. This will be anything from 650 horsepower up to 1200 horsepower, possibly even 1500 horsepower. Some 2JZs have been proven to go higher, maybe 1800 horsepower, sometimes 2000 horsepower on the stock block. Now this is where you're going to go a massive turbo and forget drivability. With 3 litres of cubic capacity, you're going to have massive lag in any car that you're running these horsepower levels on, because you've got to go huge in the turbo. The turbo's not even going to spool up until you're around about 5,000 RPM, 4.5 to 5,000 RPM to hit full boost, depending on the size of the turbo. So we're talking massive turbos here and huge injectors. You may want to go E85 petrol, of course. If you're dealing with this sort of horsepower, you should go some type of race fuel, or E85 would be the way to go. You've got to change all the fuel pumps in the back. You've got to change your intake manifold. Now, the aftermarket support for the 2JZ is huge. It's leaps and bounds ahead of anything for the B58. The Hypertune intake manifolds that you can buy for the 2JZ is proven to take up to 2000 horsepower on the heads. So there is so much support right behind the LS engines. The 2JZ and the LS engines have so much aftermarket support, and everything has been already made for them over the years. So you've got potential to run massive horsepower figures with the 2JZ. Also, you have the steel block here, the cast iron block, which is a very rigid block and a very dense block. The B58 is running an aluminium block, and yes, it's a closed deck design, and aluminium can be strong, we definitely know that, but all in all, it's still a cast aluminium block. It is not billet. So once you get to these high horsepower engines, what tends to happen with blocks that aren't that strong is they split. They will basically vibrate themselves to death and chuck a piston out the side of the bore. So rigidity is everything, and the density of the material to do with how high a certain block can take in the horsepower levels. And the 2JZ seems to have exceeded most engines in this department. So this, I would put definitely the 2JZ as the ultimate winner in the power figures, hands down, over the B58. Until we see some huge figures out of the B58, I really don't think it's capable of the outright figures that the 2JZ is at the moment. Maybe in the future we will see. You can also get a billet 2JZ block these days. I don't believe B58 have had a billet one made yet, but there is a replica 2JZ block that is a billet, and that can easily handle up to 1000 horsepower. It depends on who's building it. Simply put, the 2JZ is one of the most incredible engines that has ever been designed by any car maker in world history.